It started out casual, but quickly became personal, intimate. "Have you always been curious about electricity?" he asked, his tone of voice carrying a double meaning. "Not so much, but you definitely made it sound interesting," I replied, trying to hide the smile that threatened to break out. That day was the start of something I couldn't control. Each subsequent encounter with Jake seemed to increase the charge of electricity between us. Today, seeing him in my living room, the reality of the situation hit me hard. "Are you all right?" he asked, taking another step towards me. "I'm fine. I just didn't expect to see you here," I admitted, feeling my heart speed up even more. He raised his hand and touched my arm, an immediate spark igniting between us. I didn't know what to do, but I knew that nothing would be the same after that touch. The silent question hung in the air. How could this have happened? As we stood there in silence, our gazes and touches laden with unspoken meanings, I knew I was on the brink of something dangerous, something that could change my life forever. And at that moment, the line between right and wrong began to disappear, leaving only the desire and need to feel more of that electricity that Jake and I shared. Chapter 2. The day Jake came to fix the wiring in the house is still fresh in my memory. It was a sunny morning, and I was home alone, enjoying a rare moment of peace. The sound of the doorbell snapped me out of my thoughts. When I opened the door, there he was, Jake, the electrician. He was tall, with broad shoulders, and a smile that made my heart race. "Good morning, I'm Jake. I've come to fix the wiring," he said, and I felt a wave of warmth run through my body. "Come in," I replied, trying to keep my composure. As he worked, the tension in the air was palpable. I couldn't take my eyes off him. His movements were precise, and there was something mesmerizing about the way he concentrated on his work. Jake seemed oblivious to my presence, but I could sense that he knew I was watching. At one point, he looked at me, and our eyes met. It was a look full of meaning, as if he could read my deepest thoughts. My heart raced, and I realized I was holding my breath. "You have a beautiful smile," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. I was speechless for a moment, surprised by his boldness. "Thank you," I replied, blushing. From that moment on, our interaction changed. The casual conversation about wiring quickly became more personal. We talked about our interests, our lives. I told him about my work, my dreams, and he told me about his adventures as an electrician. Every word exchanged between us seemed to carry a weight, a promise of something more. I felt an irresistible attraction to Jake, something I had never felt before. And from the looks he gave me, I knew he felt the same way. When he finished the job, I didn't want him to leave. "Thanks for fixing the wiring," I said, trying to prolong the goodbye. "It was a pleasure," he replied, with a smile that made my heart leap. "If you need anything else, you know where to find me." I knew that wouldn't be my last meeting with Jake. Something inside me had changed that day. The spark between us was impossible to ignore, and I knew I was about to cross a dangerous line. The sound of the key turning in the lock always gave me a feeling of anxiety. My heart raced, and I could feel the blood pulsing in my ears. That afternoon, when I entered the living room, I was surprised by a sight that made my heart stop for a second. Jake, the electrician, was standing there, looking at me with a mixture of surprise and desire. "Hi, I didn't know you'd be here," he said, a half smile appearing on his face. I could feel the tension in the air. It was as if a spark had ignited something between us. The initial touch, when our arms brushed as we passed each other, was electrifying. A silent question hung in the air. How could this have happened? That moment brought back memories of the day Jake first came to fix the wiring in the house. I remember the palpable tension as he worked, the looks we exchanged, full of meaning. Our first conversation was casual, about the wiring and the problems in the house, but it soon became more personal. "You look stressed," he commented as he adjusted a wire. "It's work and the house, all at the same time," I replied, feeling a sudden need to vent. That afternoon, Jake's unexpected visit took me by surprise. As he passed me in the corridor, his accidental touch sent an electric current through my body. I couldn't help the shiver that ran up my spine. "Sorry," he mumbled, but his eyes said something else. In the kitchen, he was so close that I could feel his warm breath. The first kiss was stolen, a mixture of surprise and desire. I pulled back, but the desire was undeniable. After that, the text messages started to get bolder and bolder. Each new message brought growing excitement. However, the guilt was overwhelming. At night, looking at my husband, Michael, sleeping next to me, I felt like a monster. The first lie about a work appointment was like crossing a line of no return. "I have to work late tonight," I lied, trying to keep my voice steady. The secret meeting at the neighborhood cafe was a test of my nerves. The sexual tension between us was almost unbearable. I couldn't resist the urge to suggest a nearby motel. The first night of passion with Jake was intense, something I had never experienced before. The next morning, remorse mixed with excitement. I knew I was playing with fire, but the adrenaline was addictive. At home, it was a challenge to keep my composure. Fantasies invaded my mind in the quiet moments, and I realized that I was beginning to enjoy the danger. Jake then suggested a weekend out of town. It was hard to come up with a convincing lie for Michael about a business trip, but I managed. In the hotel room, far away from everything, the passion between us was unbridled. The fear of being discovered mixed with adrenaline, creating a whirlwind of emotions. Getting back into the routine was a challenge. Michael became suspicious of my behavior. Jake gave me an ultimatum: leave Michael or finish the case. The indecision was excruciating. On the one hand, there was Michael's stable, secure love. On the other, the burning, uncontrollable passion for Jake. I decided to stay with Jake and lie to Michael. Jake's reaction was unexpected. He seemed more reserved, but still suggested meeting in the middle of the afternoon. I hesitated, but reluctantly agreed. I arrived at Jake's apartment that fateful afternoon. He was already half naked, waiting for me. The sudden sound of the phone ringing interrupted the moment, bringing me back to reality. The shock and excitement of realizing that betrayal was becoming a regular part of my life was overwhelming. "We can't go on like this," I said, feeling the weight of the situation. "You know I can't stay away from you," he replied, moving closer. And there, in the midst of that whirlwind of emotions, I realized that my life would never be the same. I was sitting on the sofa in the living room, reading a book and trying not to think too much about life. The sound of the key turning in the lock made my heart race. Michael was on a business trip, and I knew exactly who was about to enter. Jake walked into the living room, and when he saw me, his gaze was a mixture of surprise and desire. It was as if the tension between us was palpable. He was there, in his electrician's uniform, but there was something else. Something that made my blood boil. "Hi," he said, with a smile that made my heart beat even faster. "Hi," I replied, trying to stay calm, but feeling the immediate spark between us. I stood up, and before I could think, he was next to me, so close that I could feel the warmth of his body. The initial touch was like an electric charge, and I silently asked myself, how did this happen? How did I get to this point? He put his hand on my cheek, and the world seemed to stop. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice full of concern and desire. "Yes," I replied, even though I knew I wasn't okay at all. I was confused, excited, and guilty. Jake moved even closer, and without thinking, I pulled him into a kiss. a kiss that started out soft, but quickly became intense. The taste of his lips was addictive, and I couldn't stop. "We need to be quick," he whispered, interrupting the kiss. Michael could call at any moment. I nodded, knowing he was right. The danger only made everything more exciting. We moved to the sofa, where everything began to happen so naturally, and yet so wrongly. Every touch and every sigh was a mixture of pleasure and guilt. For a moment, we pulled apart, panting. "This is crazy," I said, trying to catch my breath. "I know," he replied, with a smile at the corner of his mouth. "But it's good madness, isn't it?" I didn't know how to answer. All I knew was that I wanted more. My body wanted more. And from the way Jake looked at me, he wanted it too. The tension between us was almost unbearable. Every movement, every touch, seemed to carry a gigantic weight of repressed desire. I knew I was playing with fire. The look in his eyes, so full of hunger, made my legs tremble. "You're incredible," he said, caressing my face. "I've never felt that before." "Me neither," I admitted, feeling a twinge of guilt at the thought of Michael. But at the same time, there was an excitement I couldn't ignore. "We need to be careful," he said, as if reading my thoughts. "I don't want to put you in danger." I nodded. "I know. Let's be careful." He pulled me in for another kiss, and for a moment, the outside world ceased to exist. There was no Michael. There was no guilt. There was just the two of us and the desire that consumed us. When we finally pulled away, we both knew it was only the beginning. The spark between us was undeniable, and from that moment on, our lives would never be the same. The secret meeting at the neighborhood cafe started like any other morning. I was tense, my heart beating fast as I walked to the agreed location. The cafe was only a few blocks from home, but the short distance didn't ease the anguish I felt. When I walked in, I spotted Jake sitting at a table in the corner, looking restlessly at his watch. "Hi," I said, trying to sound natural. He looked up and smiled, that smile that always made my stomach turn. "Hi, you look beautiful," he replied, and my face flushed instantly. We sat facing each other, and the sexual tension between us was almost palpable. Every movement, his lips were hot and demanding, and I responded with the same intensity. "I've wanted this since the first day we met," he murmured between kisses, his hands exploring my body. "Me too," I confessed, my voice barely above a whisper. That first night of intense passion was a mixture of emotions. The touch of his hands, the way he knew exactly where to touch me, everything was overwhelming. It was as if we were in a world apart, where nothing else mattered but the two of us. When we finally fell into bed, panting, I knew that my life would change forever. "This is just the beginning," he said, stroking my cheek. "I know," I replied, feeling a mixture of happiness and guilt. Remorse began to creep in as I tried to sleep next to Jake. I thought about Michael, my husband, and the lies I had started to tell. But at the same time, the excitement of being with Jake was undeniable. I was trapped in a vicious cycle of desire and guilt, and I didn't know how to get out of it. When I woke up the next morning, Jake was still sleeping next to me. I looked at him, and an involuntary smile appeared on my face. But then, reality came back full force. I needed to go home, back to my normal life. "I have to go," I whispered, trying not to wake him. He slowly opened his eyes and took my hand. "I know, but it's not going to end here, right?" "No," I said, squeezing his hand back. "It won't." As I left the motel, my heart was heavy. Knowing that I would have to pretend to be normal at home was a huge weight. But at the same time, the fantasies about Jake continued to haunt me. Every moment of silence, every glance at Michael, made me question my choices. The pleasure in taking risks was starting to become addictive, Getting home was a challenge. Michael was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. "Hi, love," he said, smiling. "How was the meeting?" "It was good," I lied, trying to sound convincing. "Sorry I was late." He kissed me on the forehead, without suspecting a thing. "It was fine. I trust you." Those words hit me like a punch. His trust was something I was betraying, and guilt consumed me. But at the same time, the memory of Jake's touch, of his kiss, made me want more. I was caught between two worlds, and I didn't know which one to choose. That night with Jake was just the beginning of an intense and dangerous journey. I knew I was playing with fire, but desire was stronger. And at that moment, I didn't want to stop. When I woke up that morning, the sunlight was streaming through the bedroom curtains, creating soft designs on Michael's face. He was sleeping soundly beside me, oblivious to the whirlwind of emotions that was consuming me inside. I felt a mixture of remorse and excitement, a feeling that made me restless and anxious. How had I gotten to this point? I got up carefully so as not to wake him, and went to the kitchen to prepare the coffee. Every movement seemed heavier, as if guilt were imbued in every gesture. As the aroma of coffee filled the house, my mind was filled with thoughts of Jake. The memory of the night before, the first night we spent together, was still fresh in my mind. I remember every detail. The tension between us at the neighborhood cafe, the impulsive decision to go to a nearby motel, the intensity of every touch, every kiss. That night, it was as if a part of me that had been asleep had finally woken up. But now I was back to my routine, trying to keep my composure and pretend that nothing had changed. Michael came into the kitchen, still half asleep, and kissed me on the forehead. "Good morning, love," he said, with a reassuring smile. I smiled back, feeling a tightness in my heart. How could I do this to him? "Good morning," I replied, trying to sound natural. "Would you like some coffee?" As he nodded and sat down at the table, my cell phone vibrated in the pocket of my bathrobe. It was a message from Jake. My heart raced when I saw his name on the screen. I read the message quickly, feeling a shiver run down my spine. "I've been dreaming about you all night. When can I see you again?" Excitement grew inside me, but at the same time, I felt a wave of guilt. I looked at Michael, who was absent-mindedly reading the newspaper. How could I go on with this? Later, at work, I tried to concentrate on my tasks, but my mind kept returning to Jake. The fantasies became bolder and bolder, filling the quiet moments. I felt alive, as if I had rediscovered a part of myself that I didn't even know existed. And at the same time, I felt guiltier than ever. At the end of the day, I returned home to find Michael preparing dinner. He seemed so happy to see me, so oblivious to what was going on. We had dinner together, talked about the day, and he wasn't even aware of the lies I was telling. That night, while Michael slept next to me, I took out my cell phone and sent Jake a message. "Tomorrow? Same place?" He replied almost immediately, "I can't wait." I fell asleep with a smile on my face, but also a heaviness in my heart. I was discovering the pleasure of taking risks, but at what cost? The next morning, I woke up determined to keep my composure. Michael kissed me before leaving for work, and I got ready to meet Jake. On the way, my mind was a mixture of anxiety and excitement. When I arrived at the cafe, there he was, sitting at the same table as always. His eyes lit up when he saw me, and I felt my heart race. We sat and talked, but the sexual tension between us was almost unbearable. Every touch, every look, seemed charged with electricity. "Let's get out of here," he suggested, his voice low and husky. I nodded, almost without thinking. We went to a nearby motel, and the intensity of our passion was overwhelming. Every moment with Jake was a mixture of pleasure and guilt, of excitement and remorse. The next morning, I woke up next to him, feeling the same whirlwind of emotions. The challenge of keeping my composure at home became greater and greater. Fantasies about Jake filled my mind, even at the most unexpected moments. I was discovering a side of myself that I had never explored, a pleasure in taking risks that made me anxious and excited. But at the same time, I knew I was playing with fire. And eventually, all the lies and secrets would have consequences. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when my cell phone vibrated. It was a message from Jake. He suggested we spend a weekend out of town. My heart raced at the thought. I knew this meant lying to Michael in a more elaborate way than ever before. It was risky, but the idea excited me as much as it scared me. "I need to leave for a business trip at the weekend," I told Michael that night. He looked at me with a tired expression, but didn't suspect a thing. "That's fine, darling. Just let me know if you need anything," he replied, turning his attention back to the newspaper. On Friday evening, I packed my suitcase with clothes I would never wear on a business trip. I was nervous, but also anxious. Jake would pick me up at a meeting point far enough away that no one would see us together. When I got into his car, the air was charged with electricity. He looked at me with such intense desire that I had to look away to avoid losing myself completely. "Ready for the best weekend of your life?" he asked with a mischievous smile. I just nodded, unable to find the words. We arrived at the hotel in a small town, far enough away that no one would recognize us. The room was simple, but what mattered was his presence. As soon as the door closed, Jake pulled me close and kissed me with unbridled passion. Our clothes were thrown on the floor as we moved towards the bed. "I never imagined this was possible," I said, panting. "Neither did I," he replied, his eyes shining with desire. That night was a mixture of excitement and fear. Every touch, every kiss, was a reminder that we were breaking all the rules. But deep down, I knew that something had changed. Jake's offer of a weekend out of town had only been the beginning. I was entering dangerous territory, and I didn't know where it would lead. When I returned to my routine, I found it extremely difficult to pretend to be normal. Every time Michael looked at me, he seemed to know something. I tried to maintain the same serene expression, but inside, I was a wreck. His suspicions began to creep in subtly. He would ask questions about my day in a tone that I couldn't decipher. I answered, trying not to look nervous, but it was like walking a tightrope. "You've been different lately," Michael commented one evening while we were having dinner. "Are you sure everything's okay at work?" "Yeah, I'm just a bit tired," I lied, trying not to meet his gaze. "A lot of pressure there." Michael's suspicions grew by the day. He started sneaking into my office, claiming he wanted to take me to lunch. Although I tried to act natural, my heart was always in my mouth, fearing that he would find out something. Jake, on the other hand, was becoming increasingly impatient. His messages became more intense, demanding more of my attention. He no longer wanted to share my time and mind with Michael. "You need to make a decision," Jake told me one afternoon when we met in a cafe. "I can't go on like this. Either you leave Michael, or we end this once and for all." Those words hit me like a punch in the gut. I didn't know what to do. The stable love I had with Michael was comfortable, secure. But the burning passion I felt for Jake was something I had never experienced before. I was torn by indecision. I need time," I said to Jake, feeling tears start to form in my eyes. "It's not an easy decision. Time is something I don't have anymore," Jake replied, his voice firm and resolute. "I want you, but not like this." I spent the next few days in a constant state of anguish. When I was with Michael, I tried to act normally, but my mind was always elsewhere, thinking about Jake, about the ultimatum he had given me. Every time I looked at Michael, guilt consumed me. But the thought of losing Jake was unbearable. One night, while Michael slept next to me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to find a solution. What was more important to me? The stability of my marriage, or the overwhelming passion I felt for Jake? I wondered if it was possible to have both, but I knew it wasn't. The next day, I met Jake after work. He was serious, waiting for my answer. My heart was pounding as I approached him. "I can't leave Michael," he finally said, the words coming out with difficulty. "But I don't want to lose you either." Jake looked at me for a long moment, saying nothing. Finally, he sighed. "This isn't fair to either of us," he said. "But if that's what you've decided, then we'll carry on like this for now." I felt relief mixed with fear. I knew this wasn't a permanent solution, but at least for now, I wouldn't lose Jake. Even so, the tension at home was growing. Michael was becoming more and more suspicious, and I felt that he was on the verge of discovering the truth. One afternoon, Jake sent me a bold message, suggesting meeting up in the middle of the afternoon. My first reaction was hesitation. What if Michael found out? But the desire to see Jake was stronger than any fear. "Okay, I'll be there," I replied, feeling a mixture of excitement and dread. I arrived at Jake's apartment that afternoon with my heart beating fast. When he opened the door, he was already half naked, waiting for me. Before I could say anything, the phone suddenly rang, interrupting the moment. "Ignore it," said Jake, pulling me closer. But I couldn't. The reality of betrayal was becoming a regular part of my life, and I didn't know how much longer I could sustain this farce. When I made the decision to stay with Jake and lie to Michael, I knew I was treading on dangerous ground. It was a choice that left me with a cramped heart and a conflicted mind. But the attraction to Jake was something I could no longer resist. Every message, every touch, every look between us made my body vibrate in a way I had never experienced before. I decided that I couldn't give up this feeling, even if it meant living a lie. That afternoon, while Michael was at work, I received a message from Jake. "Are we meeting this afternoon?" he wrote. My heart raced. I hesitated for a moment before replying. "Where?" He suggested the neighborhood cafe, the same one where we met the first time, but this time the invitation was bolder. "We can go to my apartment afterwards," he said, and I knew exactly what he meant by that. The initial hesitation was great. I looked at Michael, who was in his office, working hard to support us. Guilt was eating me up inside, but the excitement of being with Jake was something I couldn't ignore. "Okay," I replied. "I'll meet you at 3 p.m. At 3 p.m. sharp, I walked into the cafe and saw Jake sitting at a table in the corner. His smile when he saw me made my heart race. He stood up and gave me a tight hug. "You came," he whispered in my ear, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. "Yes," I replied, trying not to show how nervous I was. After a quick coffee and a few intense glances, Jake suggested we go to his apartment. "Are you ready?" he asked, his eyes burning with desire. I nodded, even though inside I was a mess of emotions. We walked to his apartment, which was just a few blocks from the cafe. Every step felt like a hammer hitting my heart. When we arrived, he opened the door and pulled me inside. "I've been waiting for this all day," he said as he kissed me urgently. I returned the kiss, letting all the guilt and hesitation dissipate at that moment. Passion overtook me, and before I knew it, we were in his bedroom. Jake was already half naked, and that made me hesitate for a second. He noticed my hesitation. "Are you okay?" he asked, the concern visible on his face. "Yeah, this is so wrong," I admitted, my voice almost a whisper. "But we want this, don't we?" he replied, pulling me closer. "I want you, and I know you want me too." Those words were my undoing. I gave myself over completely, letting desire take over. In the midst of the passion, the sound of the phone ringing interrupted us. My heart almost stopped. "Who could it be?" I asked, trying to hide the panic in my voice. "Don't worry," Jake said, ignoring the phone and pulling me back to him. But my mind was already racing. What if it was Michael? What if he suspected something? That adrenaline rush, mixed with excitement, made me realize how deeply I was involved in this betrayal. I knew it was becoming a regular part of my life. Every time I lied to Michael, every time I met up with Jake, it was a new layer of complication that I added to my existence. "What are we doing?" I asked Jake, my voice heavy with emotion. "Living," he replied simply, kissing me again. "We're living." And at that moment, I decided that, even with all the consequences, I was going to carry on. Betrayal had become part of my life, and I was prepared to face whatever came my way. That day was like any other. I left work early with a lame excuse about a meeting that simply didn't exist. My heart was racing, and I could hardly breathe. When I arrived at Jake's apartment, anxiety consumed me. I opened the door with the key he had given me weeks before. The sound of the key turning in the lock seemed louder than usual, echoing in my head. My heart was almost bursting out of my mouth. "Hi, love," Jake said with a mischievous grin, already half naked, waiting for me in the living room. I couldn't help the look of surprise and desire that crossed my face. He was there, so at ease, so sure of himself. It was impossible not to remember the first time we met, when he came to fix the wiring in the house. The tension between us was palpable from the start. "Hi," I replied, trying to stay calm, but my voice came out shaky. He approached me, and the initial touch sent a spark through my body. It was as if every cell in me was alive, on alert. I couldn't understand how it had happened. How had I, a married woman, gotten to this point? "You look beautiful," he whispered in my ear, as his hand slid around my waist. Before I could reply, the sudden sound of the phone ringing interrupted us. It was as if the outside world was trying to invade our little haven of sin. My heart raced even faster, if that was possible. Shock and excitement mixed inside me. Betrayal was becoming a regular part of my life, and it terrified me as much as it excited me. "Let me touch it," Jake said, pulling me closer. "I can't," I replied, pulling away a little. "It might be important." I picked up the phone and looked at the screen. It was Michael, my husband. Guilt hit me like a wave, but at the same time, something inside me liked the danger, the adrenaline. "It's Michael," I said, almost voiceless. Jake raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. I picked up, my voice shaking. "Hi, love," I said, trying to sound normal. "Hi, sweetheart. I just called to see if everything was okay. You seemed a bit strange when you left this morning," Michael said, his voice full of concern. "I'm fine, just a bit tired," I lied, feeling the weight of guilt intensify. "Okay, I just wanted to make sure. I love you," he said. "I love you too," I replied, quickly hanging up. I put the phone away and looked at Jake. His eyes were filled with a mixture of desire and something else, something I couldn't identify. "I'm sorry about that," I said, trying to regain control of the situation. "Don't worry," he replied, pulling me back into his arms. "You're here now, and that's what matters." He kissed me, and I gave myself over completely. Every touch, every caress, was like a drug, taking me to a state of ecstasy that I had never experienced before. In the back of my mind, guilt and excitement continued to fight, but at that moment, nothing else mattered but Jake and me. That afternoon was a whirlwind of emotions. When we finally parted, I was exhausted, but at the same time, more alive than ever. Dressing quickly, I took one last look at Jake, who was still in bed, with a satisfied smile on his face. See you tomorrow? I asked, trying to hide the anxiety in my voice. Of course, he replied, winking at me. I left the apartment, my heart still racing. Every step I took was a reminder of what had just happened. Betrayal was becoming a regular part of my life, and I didn't know how to feel about it. The guilt was overwhelming, but the excitement was addictive. As I drove home, my hands trembled on the steering wheel. I knew I was playing with fire, but I couldn't stop. Jake was like a drug to me, and each encounter only increased my addiction. When I got home, I found Michael in the kitchen, preparing dinner. He smiled at me, and my heart ached with guilt. "How was your day?" he asked, kissing my forehead. "It was good," I lied, trying to smile back. "And yours?" "Quiet," he replied, turning his attention back to the stove. "I made your favorite dish." I sat at the table, watching him. The normality of our life together seemed such a stark contrast to the chaos inside me. I knew I was playing with the happiness we had built together, but I couldn't tear myself away from Jake. "I love you," I said suddenly, feeling the need to reaffirm it to myself as much as to him. "I love you too," Michael replied, not realizing the internal struggle I was facing. That night, lying next to him, my mind went back to Jake. The fantasies, the touches, the kisses. Guilt and arousal continued their dangerous dance inside me. I knew I was on a path of no return, but I couldn't help it. Jake had become a part of me, and I didn't know how or if I wanted to change that.